In the late 1980s, two entertainment Goliaths, Disney and Universal, were both planning to open studio backlot inspired theme parks in Central Florida. They were pitching Florida as the new Hollywood of the South, and when both of these theme parks opened, the largest tangible example of that concept, in this case being within Universal Studios Florida, was Nickelodeon Studios. It was coined as the world's first headquarters for kids, and it was part functioning studio where many of the iconic Nickelodeon shows of the 90s were filmed, and part theme park attraction, where guests could actually watch the production of those very shows. But this was all relatively short-lived, and it was all closed down by the mid-2000s. It would then continue to sit abandoned for years to come. What's up guys, my name is Jake, and in this special 85th episode of Abandoned, let's revisit an iconic abandoned theme park attraction I did a video on all the way back in early 2015. And let's take a deeper look into this fascinating story and find out what has happened since. This is Nickelodeon Studios, Florida. In the mid-1980s, as it happens, both the Walt Disney Company and Universal Studios were both planning new theme parks in Florida. Disney World, of course, was already well established, with two existing theme parks. Championed by their CEO, Michael Eisner, the plan was to build a large live-action and animation studio in conjunction with a theme park. Universal, on the other hand, was already working on something very similar. They were planning their first theme park outside of Hollywood, and just like their competitor, later named Disney MGM Studios, Universal Studios Florida would feature both an active production studio as well as a theme park. All of this was being touted as the new Hollywood of the South, a cheaper alternative to shooting film and television in California, and a way for these companies to make additional money on tourists coming to view those very productions live. It was an interesting idea, and there was a lot of hype around it, as well as a fierce rivalry between Disney and Universal. But then there was Nickelodeon, a popular and by now well-funded children's network that had been producing original programming like Rated K for Kids, Mr. Wizard's World, Pinwheel, and the extremely popular Double Dare. But the thing was, Nickelodeon had all of these shows being filmed in different locations across North America. They had no large central production facility, and that left them fragmented without the ability to scale new productions. By the late 1980s, Universal Studios Florida was more or less finalized in its overall design, even with some initial construction already underway. In fact, their sound stages in Florida were already nearing completion. Ultimately, Universal pitched Nickelodeon on the idea of joining forces and setting up a production facility, but crucially give Universal a serious draw for younger children, as well as a year-round interactive attraction within the production central area of the park. The deal was inked in 1988, with Nickelodeon signing on for a multi-year contract, allowing them use of a large administration building as well as two dedicated sound stages flanking it. They would become Stage 18 and Stage 19, with the middle building being called B-17. It was clearly a last-minute addition to the park, which is why it's not depicted on most concept art as well as the public model. It was now going to be placed along a new street just south of the park, jetting off the main thoroughfare. On June 7th, 1990, Universal Studios Florida had officially opened to the public, and with it, so did Nickelodeon Studios Florida. The studio facade was plastered in a very 90s color scheme, but overall playful and colorful, very indicative of the Nickelodeon aesthetic. The courtyard was also adorned with Nickelodeon-themed benches and the Slime Geyser, which was theatrically unveiled later that year. There were also some photo ops, and later a few props and a gift shop. However, when the park first opened, you didn't necessarily feel all too disconnected from where you just arrived, as just beyond those photo ops was a weirdly large empty field and then the parking lot, which the trees didn't really do a good job at hiding. No matter, as the real attraction was once you got inside. After you queued up under a large green canopy, you'd be brought through the studio, ascending up an escalator, up a large open-air loft, which was later painted with character murals. You'd be brought down large, elevated, and glass-enclosed walkways over top the stages, looking down onto the productions and having a guide explain to you what you were looking at. Since Nickelodeon's contract with Universal stated that they needed to be in production pretty much every day of the year, there would always be something for guests to gawk at. The tour would also bring you by control rooms, costuming, a kitchen, and rather intrusively, the dressing rooms. Plus, kids would have the chance to participate in game shows and activities, as well as audition to be on the actual televised shows that were being taped that day. For those who weren't selected, well, they would at least have the option to be in the live studio audience. Through the early 1990s, the tour would constantly evolve, and so would the roster of shows being filmed at the studios. Nick Jr. filmed Eureka's Castle and Gullah Gullah Island, sketch comedy shows included Roundhouse and All That, but the most sizable roster of titles came in the form of game shows like Figure It Out, the numerous Double Dare variations, Nick Arcade, Nickelodeon Guts, Global Guts, What Would You Do, and Legends of the Hidden Temple. Some other hit shows included Launchbox and Keenan and Kel. See, I said it properly this time. Yeah, well, it almost took me a decade to properly pronounce it in a video, but it's fine. If you weren't one of the 7,000 people who screamed at how I pronounced it in my original video, then I can't help you. Anyways, those were just some of the more notable shows that were being filmed there. And of course, there were plenty more. Really, almost every original show Nickelodeon produced through the early to mid-1990s was filmed in the Florida studio. If you want a more detailed timeline of where and when these actual shows were in production, I highly suggest watching Paparina's video on Nick Studios. I'll leave a link in the description below. Clearly though, the early years at the studios were an exciting time. The opening telecast, for example, was a big event in of itself, and throughout America, commercials would air on TV, compelling children to come visit and go behind the scenes at Nickelodeon. The studio would also be heavily marketed in other forms, mainly in the programs themselves, often showing off the studios, interacting with guests, holding special events, and announcing its filming location at the end of each show. One particularly notable one was the 1992 time capsule burial. A special broadcast was filmed just for the ceremony as kids pulled together a collection of pop culture items that were relevant of the time, not to be opened until 2042. Mike O'Malley hosted the ceremony and himself made predictions, stating that kids of the future will always be able to visit this location and the world's first headquarters for kids, which would really turn out to be wishful thinking. Regardless, Nickelodeon at the time was extremely popular, and the studios were a big draw for Universal's guests as a whole, especially since Universal was a bit of a letdown on opening day and didn't have a vast number of attractions. Nickelodeon was a central part of the Universal experience, especially for those who actually wanted to see behind the scenes of TV production. The park's tram tour would also drive right through the courtyard, as well as take guests beyond the pathways and behind the main stages. But as time passed, Nickelodeon was starting to feel the long-term effects on how shooting in Florida would actually work. It turns out, people don't really want to have to relocate to Central Florida. Now yes, production labor was often cheaper and Nickelodeon wasn't forced by law to hire union staff, but on the other hand, there was also a significantly less capable talent pool. As for the talent themselves, well, many strongly objected to actually moving to Florida, so most would just fly across the country for filming. It began to get complicated, especially as directors brought their shows off-site and filmed them elsewhere. There were also just logistical headaches on the core design of the studios. Long-term, it was beginning to become a challenge to have theme park guests constantly flowing through active and inactive, made to look active because they were contractually made to, production space. Staff and talent were always being observed, making this a less than ideal place to work. This is a problem that Universal Studios Florida was facing as a whole, as was Disney MGM Studios. Theme park rides, never-ending guests, and even the weather with the never-ending rain on the metal sound stages were a constant annoyance. Disney was starting to plan and even build new attractions completely divorced from any backstage theming. Universal was also expanding in a big way, turning this single theme park into a whole resort, complete with new infrastructure, hotels, vast landscaping, a retail and entertainment district, and a completely new theme park that would ultimately become Islands of Adventure. This was a big, nearly $3 billion step for the entire resort, and it also meant that the original Universal Studios park would see some updates. By the mid to late 90s, it was following in Disney's footsteps, building brand new attractions based on IP instead of backlot theming. It was a new direction for the park and saw the elimination of the studio tram tour. The fact of the matter was, Universal Studios Florida wasn't seeing the number of high-profile film and television like they were in California. Because there was nothing interesting being filmed on site, guests weren't all that interested in the backlot tours. Nickelodeon Studios was becoming the only way to see a real production, but even there, original programming was beginning to dry up. More producers and directors advocated for moving their productions to California, notably Keenan and Kel and all that. For the entirety of 1996, there were no live audience game shows being filmed on site, and the studio's fate was becoming more and more apparent by the following year. In 1997, Nickelodeon purchased the Earl Carroll Theater along Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. They renamed it to Nickelodeon on Sunset and began transferring some of their productions over to that facility. Meanwhile, Nickelodeon laid off around 10% of their full-time workforce in Florida. While some of those live-action productions were moving to California, animation was now becoming a larger part of the network's overall roster, and that was all being produced over on the West Coast. The Florida studio didn't even have a facility capable of producing animated television. By the late 90s, Universal Studios Florida was operating at a net loss, utilizing their studio space less and less. But they couldn't really do anything about it other than essentially sublease their space to third parties, since they were contractually locked into the facility until at least 2005. Universal certainly wanted them to stay, as the attraction for the studio was still pretty popular, despite the park-wide shift in theming. By the early 2000s, production within the two stages would become less frequent, with even more employees laid off. This was also following the lackluster opening of Universal's new theme park, Islands of Adventure, and that paired with the tourism downturn of 2001, well, Universal was in a bad place overall. Nick Studios Florida was hemorrhaging money and providing little value overall to the greater network. Fewer productions also made the tour attraction a lot less interesting, and left it feeling a bit tired and even dated. Things were getting so desperate that Nickelodeon began auctioning off thousands of old props. Now, this wasn't to say Nickelodeon didn't have a place in theme parks, because it obviously did, with the opening of a Jimmy Neutron simulator ride, as well as a water play area at the Universal Park in Hollywood. It was just the studios in Florida that was quickly becoming a redundant facility in the network, which meant there was just no sense in investing money in it for it to be an up-to-date attraction. I think everyone knew by this point there was no long-term future for the studio, and they were simply running it out of obligation until their contract expired. And that was coming up soon. Through the early 2000s, there were really no updates made to the experience, apart from a 2004 paint change following some damage after Hurricane Charlie, which actually saw the removal of the 90s Nickelodeon aesthetic. But this was merely cosmetic, and by early 2005, it was obvious Nickelodeon would not renew their contract. Nickelodeon Studios Florida closed on April 30th, 2005. The studios and attraction had been opened for just under 15 years. Over the next year, the studio facades would slowly lose their branding and theming, with the administrative building becoming just a green, nameless structure at the dead end of Universal Studios. The sound stages lost their advertising, all references to Nickelodeon were painted over, and the slime geyser was removed. Nickelodeon Studios was now an attraction of the past, and Universal was looking to reuse some of that real estate as soon as possible. In November of 2006, it was announced that Stage 18 would be converted to the Sharp Aquos Theater and would be hosting the Blue Man Group, a live stage show that was pretty popular at the time. Preparations for this got underway pretty quickly, painting Stage 18 blue with a massive Blue Man Group mural and moving the secondary park entrance back, turning this courtyard into public space. A long pathway would extend just beside Hard Rock Cafe, and the show opened on June 6th, 2007. By this point, the Nickelodeon time capsule from 1992 had also been dug up and relocated to the Nickelodeon Suites Resort over by Disney. It would actually remain there until 2016, when the hotel was closed and rebranded to a generic Holiday Inn. The location of the time capsule thereafter was sort of up in the air, though it was confirmed that it had been moved to the animation studios over in California. Now, following the opening of Blue Man Group, Nickelodeon did actually return to Universal Studios Florida for a brief period in 2008, utilizing the larger sound stages behind the old studios for the filming of My Family's Got Guts. Once the show wrapped, though, it would be the last time Nickelodeon would produce anything from Universal Studios in Florida. While Stage 18 was now home to this new Blue Man Group show, Stage 19 and the middle iconic Nickelodeon administrative building, well, they were just left essentially abandoned. Neither were removed or really altered in any significant way. From the outside, they just got a very bland white and blue paint job. Though curiously, the orange railings were actually left as they were, not being painted to blue until 2013. This left almost no visual design cues from the original Nickelodeon days, apart from one wall facing away from guests, though it too would be painted over in 2016. But inside, well, it was a completely different story. As early as 2006, people would start finding their way inside the now closed studio and attraction, and they would find pretty much everything exactly as it was. Photos began emerging of large props both from the attraction tour and the actual production sets themselves. Meanwhile, over in the administration offices, well, they too were left completely untouched. Back in the 90s, when the studio first opened, all of these offices were highly themed and continued to evolve as new shows came out. By 2012, all of these spaces continue to sit there abandoned, and this was notably documented by Adam the Woo. In the late 1990s, the escalator room that spanned 2 floors was, as we know, a large open space filled with the bright Florida sunshine pouring through the square windows on the 2nd floor. It was decorated with large cutouts and murals of the Wild Thornberry animated show, and now, nearly a decade since the show had been taken off the air, it sat disused and abandoned, no longer an active thoroughfare for thousands of daily guests. Nickelodeon branding of the era would be found all across doors, seating, with the distinctive typeface found everywhere else. Disused and likely outdated production equipment were left in control rooms. Dust was now collecting on the old dressing rooms, and the interior hallways were left exactly as they were the day the studio closed, adorned with floor-to-ceiling artwork from Ren and Stimpy. Some of the larger and less themed spaces were being rented out or used by Universal for smaller events, but presumably the administration space was left completely unused, which is likely why it remained stuck in time. And it was pretty shocking to see this, as everyone thought Nickelodeon from the 90s was now gone forever. But in fact, behind those walls was a completely different world from a completely different time. For a full decade, these interiors of Nickelodeon Studios remained as they were, completely abandoned. Finally, in 2015, Universal Studios' production arm announced they would be investing a little over $1 million into renovating the space to accommodate modern equipment and build out a live and post-production support facility. And it made sense to do this, especially if Universal saw there was enough demand when renting out their other stages, including the adjacent stage 19. So, work began in 2015, first with ripping out the escalators in the main entrance room and taking down the old murals. I remember being allowed inside the former studio back in December of 2015, capturing this footage from the now freshly painted, escalator-free room. It was now bland and generic, free of any Nickelodeon theming. Really, as was the rest of the structure, now completely devoid of any personality. The open space was as utilitarian as possible, with live events and production gear stacked up everywhere. From that point on, that's how the former Nick Studios would remain. Universal would construct the massive Rip Ride rocket roller coaster in the summer of 2009, and its load station would tightly squeeze up against stage 18, with the pathway to the Blue Man Group hugging the final few turns of the track. By 2012, Sharp Aquos had dropped their sponsorship for the Blue Man Group. Their logo was of course removed, and the facade saw a new paint job. It wouldn't be until early 2020 when Universal had shut down the park due to the pandemic. Blue Man Group of course shut down with it. However, upon the park's reopening, Blue Man did not join it. In fact, the show's parent company, Cirque du Soleil, had filed for bankruptcy over the pandemic, suspending all shows out of crippling financial pressure. By early 2021, it was announced Blue Man Group would not return. Stage 18 was painted over in solid blue, and City Walk access to the building was now closed off. The theater would be used on and off for seasonal events, notably the park's Grinchmas event, which streams guests into the former Stage 18 theater for a Grinch-themed Christmas show. Apart from that, it's pretty ironic that once again, this area has been left in a limbo, abandoned state. Blank blue signs now dot the area, and a permanent pathway is now gated off. The whole facade and courtyard area looks more or less the same as it did since 2007, just now with an empty box office booth and no future plans. plans. Today, the same remains true. There are no future plans, and the whole site is in a bit of a weird area. The former street that led you there, which is now adjacent to the Despicable Me attraction, is just a dead end with a gate. You can look past the gates, but the whole area looks desolate, and it doesn't seem like there's any immediate plans in the works to put the area in use. The buildings, however, are being used. It seems like the most regular tenants are the students at the Dave School for Animation and Visual Effects, which has a permanent residency within Stage 25. Though it's possible there is a more permanent tenant within Building 17 that isn't widely publicized. But with the closure of Blue Man Group, regular public access to the area is no longer possible. You can view the structure from the balcony of the Hard Rock restaurant, peek at it through the in-park gates, and maybe get an up-close look during park events. All that's left, though, is the overall architecture for the studios, hidden behind white and blue paint. At this point, there really isn't much left to see, inside and out. The only obvious tangible remnants of the area's past are in the bathrooms adjacent to the building, as on the floor you'll find the distinctive lime green tile. Nickelodeon Studios Florida, both in its tangible structure and in concept, is now a relic of the past. Both Universal Studios and Disney's MGM, now called Disney's Hollywood Studios, have largely dropped the backlot behind-the-scenes theming. From what I understand, Disney rarely utilizes their back-of-house production offices, and has either demolished or completely replaced all of their sound stages, filling them in with IP-based attractions. Universal followed suit on the attraction side of things, but kept all of their sound stages, with Nickelodeon proving to be the largest and, for a time, most successful production company in all of Florida. In fact, Nickelodeon would continue to be the largest production network creating content in Florida through its entire run of this dream as the new Hollywood of the South. And while Universal does utilize their sound stages for external production use, I don't think it's anywhere close to what they had imagined. But as time went on, the logistics and costs began to make no sense. It wasn't a viable long-term business, and enthusiasm rather abruptly shifted away from Florida and onto other profitable avenues to go down. It's clear that the dream Disney and Universal had to bring Hollywood to Florida just was a failure. But it really was a big shame to see this happen, especially for someone like me who loved Nickelodeon programming growing up. I even have photos of myself standing in Nickelodeon photo ops at Universal, one with a Nickelodeon stage looming precariously in the background, preparing to close just a few years after I visited. And now, with nearly 20 years since its closure, the remnants of the vibrant and nostalgic past is now nothing more than a seemingly innocuous, bland structure. Even with the new use given to a portion of the studios, it too is now abandoned with little hope for a future. And while Nickelodeon does have other attractions and weirdly modern and luxurious resorts around the world, it's undeniable that it's a different network and a different company. I think the studios in Florida was a really unique and really special way for a network to connect with its audience. It was a way for the cameras to turn around to the actual viewers and see kids interact with their favorite shows. It was just good television, and maybe that's coming from someone who has rose-tinted glasses, looking back fondly on something I grew up watching. But I really do think this was all lightning in a bottle. And clearly I'm not the only one thinking that, as there's lots of people out there who have massive connections with this place. I mean, it's why so many people watched my original video despite it being so poorly produced. It's also why we see classic items go up for auction and sell for insane prices, like this original time capsule cover that went up for auction and sold for close to $20,000. Same for this toilet paper from 1993, which sold for a little over $220. But regardless of how the physical relic of Nickelodeon in the 90s is now long gone, it still exists in the thousands of hours of media produced there, and the millions of kids who fondly remember visiting it. But as the doors closed for one final time, and those iconic, once abandoned interiors finally cleared out, I guess at the end of the day, both its viewers and the network grew up. Thanks for watching this video, and if you remember watching my original Nickelodeon Studios video back in 2015, well, thank you so much for sticking with me and my channel. That was an incredibly important video for the channel, and because it was so poorly put together back then, compared to now at least, I figured I should cover this very nostalgic topic again in my own way. You know the drill. If you want to follow me elsewhere, I'm also on Instagram, Twitter, and if you want to support the channel, I have merch and a Patreon where you can get exclusive perks like Polaroids, your name at the end of each video, and early video previews. My name is Jake, and seriously, thank you so much for watching.
Nickelodeon.